Gospel of the Lord.
Christ. You may be seated. There. How's that? A little bit better? Okay. It's lovely to be with you all this morning. I've been away for too long, and I'm glad to be back. Today, we turn our focus to the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's a challenge because it's probably the best known parable, or one of the 3 or 4 best known, along with probably and you all have your own lists, but I have on mine the prodigal son, the parable of the sower, and maybe the mustard seed. And part of the challenge comes from these parables' familiarity. We know the words by heart. A sower went out to sow. There was a man who had 2 sons. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. See, these, we know them by heart, and that makes them like old friends. But like old friends, we can start to take them for granted. With parables, familiarity doesn't necessarily breed contempt so much as it can breed insipid platitudes and whitewashed saccharine banality that robs the power of the parables. So we need to reintroduce ourselves to the parables so that we can remember why they hold so much power in our lives. And so it is with the parable of the Good Samaritan. A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Oh, yes, I remember that one. I need to do good things for my neighbor, especially when he's in trouble, right? But the parables of Jesus are supposed to, including the Good Samaritan, are supposed to shock us. But we've long stopped being shocked by them. Sometimes when we forget the power and the import of a parable, it can help to change a few of the details. Not to change any of the sort of meat of the story, but to get back to the power. So let me show you what I mean with this parable. Once, when Jesus was teaching his disciples, a lawyer, but not the kind of lawyer that we're talking about. We don't use that word in the same way anymore. But it's more like a professor of religion who knows a lot about the Bible and holy things. That guy stood up and asked Jesus a question. The professor of religion really didn't want to hear what Jesus had to say. He just wanted to try to test Jesus with a trick question or two. So the professor asked Jesus, "Teacher, Rabbi," may I call you Rabbi? Rabbi, I have a question. And it's a doozy, by the way. Rabbi, how can I live forever? You know, in heaven, after my death on earth. And Jesus, in his own way, he answered the question with a question. He said, and we do this all the time with Socratic method. Well, what do you think? Right? What does the Bible say about everlasting life and how to inherit it? The professor said, well, it's pretty clear. The Bible says you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You've heard that before. And Jesus replied, good answer, professor. Do that, all that loving, and you will inherit everlasting life. And not just after, but even today. If only the professor could have left well enough alone. But he had to push it. Somebody's always pushing in a parable. The professor was trying to read the fine print, if you like, to figure out a loophole, some caveat. So he asked, well, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus told him a story. Jesus always likes to illustrate points with stories. And this is what he said. He said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. That's about 18 miles, by the way. The good news is that it's a downhill journey. The bad news is it's a really rough road, and it's full of bad people doing bad things. You wouldn't want to go on that road alone, especially not at night. So, back to the story. I want to change it up a little bit. Let's say a man was going down from Ponte Vedra to Mayport. That's about 16 miles. Not quite the same, but close. So let's update our story a little bit more. A man was going down from Ponte Vedra to Mayport, and he was driving. And along the way, out of nowhere, at a red light, some thugs carjacked him. And they beat him up really bad. I mean, like within an inch of his life. And if that wasn't bad enough, they took all of his money, all of his belongings. They stripped him naked, if you can believe it, and left him for dead, right on the side of the road, on the way to Mayport. Now, later on, by chance, a priest, imagine a priest of all people, and as we just for the sake of the story, let's just say, I don't know who, let's say this story is about a priest called Father Remington, let's just say. Just for the sake of the story, that's all. Father Remington was driving down that same road to Mayport at the same time, at the same red light, the same corner, but when Father Rem saw the man all bloody and hurt and dying, if you can believe it, Father Rem stopped only for a second, but kept driving. He didn't help. He didn't even try. He probably, if I know him well, he probably muttered something about being late for a vestry meeting, or maybe he didn't want to have his fancy vestments get dirty, whatever. Father Rem just drove away. And as they used to say where I grew up, that ain't right. That just ain't right. Later still, an upstanding Christian layman from Christ Church, no names to protect the guilty, somebody who went to church every Wednesday and twice on Sunday, a tither, an usher on the vestry, was on the vestry twice, let's say. That guy was driving down the same road to Mayport at the same red light at the corner. He also stopped for a second. He saw the man, he saw that he was hurt, but he kept driving. He didn't help and he didn't even try. And that ain't right. Now, this is another place where we need to change the details a little bit, because we don't know any real Samaritans, at least I don't, like they had in Bible times. But we can still understand the point that Jesus was talking about. If we just change a couple of details, the parable starts to open up a little bit. First, a quick explainer. In that time, and for hundreds of years, Judeans and Samaritans were mortal enemies. They hated each other, even though they were next-door neighbors. Judea was right next to Samaria. It would be like, let's say, if Floridians and Georgians hated each other. Okay, maybe that's too on the nose, especially around the Gator Bowl. But so let's go a different way. Let's say it'd be like if Americans and Mexicans hated each other. So with the Judeans and the Samaritans, they were different races, or they thought they were. They were different religions, etc. And as I said, they really hated each other. Now, when we hear about the parable of the Good Samaritan, we usually just think, well, a Good Samaritan is just anyone who is helpful to another person when that person is in trouble. But as Jesus was talking about it, a Good Samaritan is not somebody who just helps out from time to time. What Jesus was trying to say, he was saying, and every Judean would have immediately understood, is that the Samaritan is the good guy in the story. And the first hearers of this story would have been utterly scandalized by the story. It would have been shocking. You mean the Samaritan? We don't even like to say his name. He's supposed to be the good guy, and the priest and the Levite, and by association, us, the Judeans, we're the bad guys? No, that can't be right. So let's finish our story. A man went down from Ponte Vedra to Mayport, and he was attacked, beaten and robbed, and left by the road. The priest didn't help. The vestryman didn't help. And here you can supply your own despised group. Choose your own. I'll give a few examples, but could be anything. So a Muslim man stopped to help the man. Or a Mexican migrant worker stopped to help, or an undocumented mother from El Salvador stopped to help, or a gay man with HIV, or a poor woman from Appalachia who has too many kids, or a prostitute, or a addict, or a whatever. The point is, I know my Samaritan. For me, he's probably a Dinka from Juba in Africa where I work, or maybe a Chinese businessman also in Africa where I work, or maybe he's a white supremacist or a redneck racist that I grew up with in my hometown. I could go on. My point is, I know my Samaritan. He is the one who convicts me by loving the ones that I'm supposed to be loving and helping. But he, my Samaritan, he loves better than me, despite the fact that he comes from a different group, a different ethnic group, a different race, a different religion, or whatever. The point is, sometimes the people that we are taught to despise love better than we do. So I know my Samaritans, and you need to know your Samaritans. Our story continues. A Samaritan, you know mine, I know mine, you know yours. A Samaritan, somebody other, somebody different, not in my tribe, somebody like that, came to the red light and saw the man suffering. I drove by and didn't help. So did another one just like me. But my Samaritan, he got out of his car and he ran over to the man, and he had compassion when I couldn't and wouldn't. And he carried the man to his car, and he drove him to Mayo, and he took care of them. And then, a few weeks later, he paid the man's bill in full. Jesus asked then, which of these three do you think was a neighbor who fell into the hands of thugs? And the professor of religion said, and he could barely even get the words out, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. He, the hated Samaritan, he had inherited eternal life, and not just for the life to come, but right now. In this story, we think Jesus is encouraging us to be like the Samaritan, but he's not. Jesus isn't asking us to go and do likewise so that we can be helpful or to be charitable like the Samaritan. Jesus doesn't want us to be good Samaritans. Rather, Jesus wants us to know who the Samaritans are in our lives. Who in your life is other? Because sometimes the other loves better than you do. Learn from her. A colleague of mine, an Episcopal priest named David Henson, He's from North Carolina. He said it well, I think. He said, if we're willing to learn from people who are different from us, if we're willing to take the time to listen to their stories, then it will be difficult to demonize them and to blame them for all that ails our country and our lives, and rage at them from afar, see. So, in the end, look around. Who is your neighbor?